If you've paid any attention to the gaming space in the last few years, you'd probably have run into the term Souls-like, a genre of games that blends brutal difficulty, vague storytelling, and some other somewhat unique features that were first spawned in the Dark and Demon Souls series. These games are developed by the now inescapable Japanese game studio FromSoftware, which has garnered quite a legendary reputation, especially after the release of their current cash cow Elden Ring, the game that brought FromSoftware fully into the mainstream spotlight, leading to a whole array of developers borrowing their ideas. If you're anything like me at some point, you may have been thinking to yourself, what's the big deal? Why is everyone so obsessed with these games? So I, in my infinite skepticism, set off on a journey to find out just why people have such a reverence for FromSoftware games. I wanted to learn exactly why these games are so popular, so I tried 3 games in the FromSoftware lineup with varying degrees of the Souls DNA woven into them, just to see if they're as good as people claim them to be. So obviously, I had to start with what was known as the king of them all, Elden Ring. But before we get into it, spoilers ahead in the footage itself, so if you want to avoid them for the games we'll be talking about, you can listen to this video or revisit it later on. I should probably rewind and tell you guys that I actually started Elden Ring in 2022, and sunk about 40 hours into the game before completely falling off around the fire giant, which was a huge pain in the ass and my personal biggest roadblock to the true end game, and I kinda slowly fizzled out of playing it. The Shadow of the Erdtree trailer, however, pulled me back in and I completed the game in early 2024. When I first picked up Elden Ring, however, I refunded it about an hour later, and in true soy boy fashion, took to Twitter to complain about how games should be relaxing and enjoyable and how I couldn't just spam R1 on the first few enemies. I rightfully got hit with the get good idiot and decided to repurchase and reinstall and give it a fair chance. After all, I'm self-aware enough to know that I went in wanting to not like it to appeal to my preconceived notions, and that's not really fair on the game. 10 hours in, despite not knowing what kind of bumbling Shakespearean-like rant I would hear next from Mike Tyson's daughter but not really caring too much, I literally could not shut the fuck up about Elden Ring. I didn't know Miquella from Melania, Mohg from Malekith, and hadn't even beaten the game, but Elden Ring truly conjured up some feelings a game hadn't made me feel in quite some time. The first thing was a sense of true exploration. Whatever kind of UX or behavioral research has been poured into games the last decade has led to this annoying formula of having everything on an open world map denoted with some kind of indicator that you need to go there and complete something. As much as I appreciate that from the standpoint of a relatively busy adult and that it saves me time in finding what the fuck I'm supposed to be doing next, it doesn't really inspire me to explore and it doesn't let the world unfold organically in front of me. I simply set a waypoint from checkpoint to checkpoint. If I come across something cool, well then if it's not too far off the beaten path, then maybe I'll check it out. With Elden Ring, other than the Graces, which are checkpoints scattered throughout the world and which lead up to the Erdtree, which is your overall goal, I have little to no idea what I'm doing, and that feels great. By the way, shout out to the Graces, the amount of dopamine that floods into my brain when I see these little swirling gold particles in the distance is actually unparalleled. It's so simple, but because of the difficulty of these games, it's a sign that I'm probably not going to lose my ruins or my progress through a dungeon. When the world of Elden Ring opens up, everything is shrouded in mystery, with a fog over the map that can be cleared by finding map totems. But as you progress, Elden Ring actually feels like you're on an epic journey, where you're constantly coming across new sub-biomes, new enemies and hidden secrets, treasures, and best of all, little openings, cracks, and holes in the world that at first don't appear to be anything but end up snaking into more elaborate hidden dungeons. At the same time, I think for the casual player who doesn't want to look at guides or scans the entire environment for items, navigating where to go might be a barrier to completing the game. For me, organically playing through the game doesn't mean that you'll hit every single item on the map, and that could potentially lock you out of regions, especially when collecting medallions to advance to the next areas are required. I know I needed to look up where those medallions were and I wasn't even sure how the lifts worked at first, and because there aren't a ton of NPCs and they all speak gibberish, you're kind of on your own to figure it out. I really appreciate how FromSoftware doesn't hold your hand, but at some moments they seem to not only not hold your hand, but are pretending social distancing measures are still in place. Despite how much I loved Elden Ring's open world, it's not all puppies and rainbows, and I do feel like there was a big quality drop off at the mountaintops of the Giants, which theoretically could have been one of the best locations in the game. Unfortunately, it features recycled enemies and pretty sparse content. Then the game shuttles you into crumbling Farum Azula and hits you with like 5 bosses in a row without spacing it out. The Elden Beast fight was great, but the fatigue absolutely had set in by then. Elden Ring also does repeat and recycle boss encounters, and this does plague the other FromSoftware titles that I played after, which was pretty disappointing. Some encounters are different enough where I didn't feel too shortchanged by seeing them again, but I can't lie, repeating content is always a pet peeve of mine, and it's another gripe I have with Elden Ring, and specifically the next FromSoftware game I moved on to after. I did want to touch on storytelling as well, as I pretty much had no idea what was happening, probably about 75% of the time. This is not a straightforward story by any means, and it relies much more on world building, secrets, and hidden snippets of lore, which is why FromSoftware gets a pass in the story department here. Their ideology of a good story is just to keep it as nebulous and mysterious as possible, which means that they don't have to write a ton of dialogue, and you're forced to seek these answers out or extrapolate, which ties into the freedom of the open world. I personally enjoy more explicit narratives better, but with this kind of dark, high fantasy setting, you're asking for trouble with too much dialogue, which could potentially get boring and tedious, and erode the very exploration aspect that the game is so great at. I also think that putting the pieces together and having the community swarm over all these details just to get the gist of the story is kind of a good move, since it creates a pretty die-hard community. Now, I do want to preface this by saying that I did use summons in about 75% of the boss fights, whether it was a jellyfish, the basic mimic tier, or an upgraded mimic tier, and although these are features implemented by the devs and are by no means, in my opinion, cheesing them, it did take away from the feeling of overcoming the challenge, which is the core appeal of these games, so I inevitably stopped using them. But at the end of the day, play how you want. For me, summons really took away from the experience, and I wish I hadn't used them, but if you want to use them, go for it, fuck it. Elden Ring has a unique combat system where you use iframes, otherwise known as invincibility frames, to dodge bosses and enemies' attacks. You'll also specifically be looking for openings where attacks are not being chained to get a few hits in. It's a beautiful push and pull, and you'll probably die a lot, but you'll probably get a little bit more proficient each time you fight a boss, eventually overcoming a challenge that you thought was insurmountable at the beginning. It is a truly addicting gameplay loop that you just need to experience to really understand. If a particular boss is giving you a lot of trouble, you can always go away and collect runes to level up so that you're dealing more damage or tanking more hits in any given encounter, or you can change up your build, go find some talismans or crystal tears to buff up your character, and that means that there's a flavor for every taste, and you can almost tailor the difficulty in this sense. So while I came around on Elden Ring and it's 100% in my top 10 games of all time, and while I love the gameplay in Elden Ring, in my opinion it isn't my favorite in the FromSoft catalog, but we'll get to that in a bit here. Just as a little aside here, Elden Ring also exposed me to Berserk, a manga with a world, universe, and story that I am also equally obsessed with, so if you are an Elden Ring or Souls fan and you've somehow not read Berserk, do yourself a favor and check that one out. So after beating Elden Ring a few months ago and faced with the excruciating wait for Shadow of the Erdtree, my growing appetite for these Souls experiences needed to be fed, and I would feed that with Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Sekiro is a whole nother beast, and while I did use summons throughout my Elden Ring playthrough, and somehow managed to miss the more challenging bosses like Mohg, Malenia, and Placidus Axe, which I've now revisited and beaten, with Malenia taking me 74 tries, I didn't want to shortchange myself of overcoming these challenges and getting that rush from Sekiro. Now with Sekiro, I'd seen a fair bit of it on YouTube through recommendations over the years, never really thinking that I'd actually be into the game due to its difficulty, but here I was itching for something challenging but fresh. Sekiro relies more heavily on a parry system, where once you've locked horns with an enemy with a sword, it heavily favors aggression. You can simply block attacks, which will build up your posture bar, which when broken will leave you open to health attacks, but if you do manage to hit the block button within the quote-unquote parry window, you will completely negate the damage done to your posture, inflicting that posture damage back to the enemy. So battles with other katana users usually end up being you slashing and them blocking, damaging their posture up until you see sparks, which indicate that the opponent has delivered a perfect parry, damaging your posture. Now at this point it's time to become a little bit more defensive and recognize a pattern combo is coming back at you and that you should learn the timings to parry them. There are some windows where you can damage vitality, which is the opponent's health, which will also lead to a slower posture recovery. This is just one of the rules of the unique combat, and humanoids with spears are fought slightly differently than giant beasts or even humans with katanas, with each enemy having their own posture and vitality traits like regeneration speed, the amount of times you need to parry or strike to damage posture, etc. It is a simple and brilliant system. Now the most common way that you're going to kill an opponent is to break their posture meter and go for a death blow. This means that you can take a health bubble away from an enemy and bypass vitality entirely. There's also no stamina system, which means you can freely sprint around and traverse the semi-open world with the grappling hook, which is fluid and responsive. There are still plenty of secrets to find in Sekiro, but you won't need 500 hours in the game to find every cave and nook and cranny like you would with Elden Ring, which is something I prefer. Maybe it's a bit of burnout from the 100+ hour open world games out there right now, but I really appreciate a tight, more linear experience these days, with a little bit of opportunity for exploring. Prosthetics can also change your gameplay ever so slightly, but for the most part if you want to beat Sekiro, you need to learn the core gameplay system, and there are no summons or busted builds to get you around that. It is unapologetic in that way. Sekiro's first playthrough is probably the hardest FromSoftware gameplay experience that I've had after completing the 3 titles. Dodging is much less effective in Sekiro, and there are unblockable and unparryable attacks that you need to react with a jump or a special skill called a Makiri counter. Well, actually that's not true. If you are a god, you can block some of these attacks, but the parry window is so small that unless you have some serious hours in Sekiro, you shouldn't even bother. Sekiro's gameplay is a work of art, and once you get the flow and rhythm down, it becomes unbelievably satisfying. Sekiro also features some of the best boss fights because of this mechanic, like the Guardian Ape, Owl Father, Genichiro, and of course the final boss, each with their own unique characteristics while still fitting into the confines of Sekiro gameplay. There are definitely some stinkers like the Blazing Bull, but it's usually because these bosses veer too far from that gameplay structure. Other than Elden Ring's Millennia, these took me many more tries, and overcoming them felt even better than any Elden Ring boss that I'd fought. It was a gameplay loop that just really clicked with me. It also doesn't hurt that the lore and story for Sekiro is much more explicit than with Elden Ring's, which makes you feel like you have some skin in the game and can follow more of the narrative. Sekiro is a lot like riding a bike though, and once you nail down the combat, it becomes probably the easiest FromSoftware game, since attack patterns and movements of enemies don't deviate as much as an Elden Ring boss. Think of Margit jumping all over the place, summoning his light weapons and smashing the ground, versus Owl Father simply standing in the pocket with you trading blows, occasionally igniting some gunpowder that you'll have to dodge. Regardless, Sekiro has the best third-person combat I've played in a game bar none, and again I found myself as obsessed with Sekiro as I was for Elden Ring, albeit for different reasons. The next FromSoft game I dipped my toes into was Armored Core 6, so I could really see the full range of different genres and styles of games that this studio develops. Armored Core features bite-sized missions perfect for busy gamers who want difficulty, high-paced action, and oh so satisfying gameplay, and is honestly pretty ideal for me. After Chapter 1, however, I thought the story was going to be painfully bad. You play as a hired merc for factions running jobs seemingly without consequences, because one second you'd be inflicting collateral damage on a corporation, and in the next mission that very same corporation would slide into your DMs and hire you for a similar one. While that didn't quite sit well with me narratively, towards the end of AC6, it pulled me in and actually delivered the highest emotional peak out of the 3 games. The minimal audio-reliant storytelling got more and more engaging, because I wanted answers, and I was surprised at how much I liked or disliked certain characters without really seeing their faces, which works for a game where people are faceless war machines perpetually in their armored cores. AC reminds me of Doom Eternal with how frenetic combat is, and it is arguably the gameplay that feels the best. Sekiro's simplicity and pacing means that there's usually only one approach to winning, and that's getting the timings, parries, and attack windows on lock. But AC was the first game where I felt compelled to change my build on the fly to overcome obstacles, especially with these absolute assholes. There are some pretty brutal build and skill checks in the game versus Sekiro's purely skill checks. I also realized I wasn't playing AC optimally either due to hardlock and the targeting system, so let me take a bit to explain that. So if you're playing AC6 on a controller and you click your right thumbstick, you can engage in what's called hardlock, which lets you focus more on movement, outstrafing, and ammo management versus aiming. This also lets you focus a bit more on building the enemy's stagger bar, which is important for temporarily immobilizing enemies so that you can just wail on them. The issue I had for most of the game was when I turned on that hard lock, out of habit I kept moving my right thumbstick, which would disengage it. I didn't actually realize this till I was a long way through the game, and when I did fix this, the game became much less aim reliant and more about resource management. I think AC could have benefited from hard lock not completely trivializing aiming. Where Armored Core really does excel is in its ability to let you experiment with builds. There's no restrictive respec needed, and you can swap to a nimble akimbo-styled pistol user to a rolling tank in a matter of 2 minutes. While I was able to brute force the first few bosses with no issues, the PCA Warrant Officer was the first big wall that forced me to change builds. Bosses in AC are very diverse, and avoiding damage in the game is impossible, so changing your build to deal with these certain traits is required. Again, FromSoftware really surprised me in the fact that they can really take the Dark Souls DNA, twist and contort it, and create a mech game that follows similar principles. All in all, AC makes you feel like the biggest badass of all the games as you boost through volleys of rockets to get a sword melee, or getting a last minute stun as you're about to get skewered with an energy weapon, allowing you to launch a barrage of your own into a staggered enemy. Not to mention that music that pulses in the background really gets the adrenaline pumping. I'm really not a mech fan, but there's something so unapologetically manly about giant mechs clashing in an all-out war, whether it's 1 versus 1 or 1 versus 20. It's like a Michael Bay movie, you're just going for the pure spectacle. The environments are desolate, industrial planetary wastelands. They seem a bit nonsensical at first, but it's likely the only way to make the gameplay shine, and I'm totally okay with that. This is the most arcadey of the 3 and I was absolutely loving it. So having spent 200 hours or so beating these 3 games, and having spent what I would consider a decent amount of time with each, it's safe to say that I am a total convert. If you want excellent world building and intricate lore, set in a mysterious dark fantasy setting, and a wide variety of ways to play that can tailor the game's difficulty, look no further than Elden Ring. If you're looking for a tight gameplay experience that allows you to get into a state of flow, a more cohesive story, and more of an emphasis on skill versus build diversity, Sekiro is for you. For frenetic, high-octane gameplay that makes you feel like a modular flying weapon that is a step above in terms of pace, then you should choose Armored Core. Now I'm just dying to try Bloodborne, the rest of the Dark Souls series, and of course, the Elden Ring DLC. So what's the big deal with FromSoftware games? Well, you'll just have to experience them for yourself. I know I'm glad I did. I appreciate you guys watching, and for more videos just like this, make sure that you are subscribed.